Good evening. My name is Pat Lester, and welcome to the visitors from Pasadena Village. Jack and Diane Schuster, known to Dick since the 4th grade, are special guests tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce Dick Myers, known to his Navy friends as RG. RG flew the A4 Skyhawk in the Vietnam War. He had 2 tours and many missions flying from the USS Hancock CVA-19. And this is his story. In order to be a Naval Aviator, RG had impressive, almost unbelievable skill, dedication, perseverance, and daring courage. And oops, I almost forgot. A prerequisite was to be handsome. So if you look at the man in the cockpit, you will see that RG met the qualification. So cheers, RG. The poem that I'm going to read to you now is known to every naval aviator. It was written by John McGee, RAF pilot, who was killed flying his Spitfire in 1941. The manuscript is in the Library of Congress. High flight. Oh, I've slipped the surly bombs of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-swift clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of, wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence, hovering there. I've chased the scouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windspread heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind, I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God.
Thank you, Pat, for that wonderful introduction. As you might have noticed, there's a little exaggeration in there, but exaggeration and aviation go hand in hand and always have. So we're ready to go with that. I would like to say that what we're doing tonight, we're talking about naval aviation, but this is not a study of naval aviation or a report. You know, it's not a thorough, comprehensive review of naval aviation, although there will be some facts in here. And it's not a history of naval aviation either, although will be some history here. But you don't need to worry about it. There will be no test at the end. So just sit back and enjoy. What this is a personal reminiscence. It's a description of my experience and my recollections of what being in the Navy was all about and what it meant. And we called it Before Top Gun because I got out in '67 and Top Gun began in '69. And what you saw in both movies was very different from what my experience was. So we wanted to make a little contrast there and have a little fun with that. I also would like to say welcome to our special guests here, the members of the Pasadena Village. For members of residents at Villa Gardens, that's who all these people are sitting up front as members of the Pasadena Village, which is an organization that I'm very much devoted to and involved in. And we will be recording this, and the recording will be available on the Pasadena Village website in the future as soon as we can get it up. So with that, we want to get started here. The first thing I want to do is show you a picture of the USS Langley. The Langley was converted into an aircraft carrier in 1921. It was the first such carrier in the fleet, and every naval aviator knows about the Langley and refers to it. All the people who flew on it are considered pioneers of naval aviation, and that's what this is about. It was converted from a coal carrier named the Jupiter, a collier, which was basically a supply ship for the fleet. They brought the coal to the fleet. That was the fuel for the fleet. So it was like a filling station afloat. And the deck, you'll notice, is about 48 feet long and 65 feet wide. And I don't know where the steering wheel was on this thing. I don't see any kind of tower there, but however, they managed to drive it around. This thing lasted in the Navy in service until 1942. At that point, it was sunk by some Japanese bombers. So it made it about 20 years or so, and is considered the beginning of naval aviation. You notice it's just nothing but a deck there that you can land and take off from. Remember that 500 feet, approximate 500 feet, that's going to be significant further on. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is Ensign Robert Hickey, and he's in his airplane on the flight deck of the Langley. And the significance of Robert Hickey is he's Pat Lester's father. Okay, so he was a graduate of Class 21B, Naval Academy. At the time the Navy put out a call for naval aviators, he was on what they call the China Patrol, cruising up and down the rivers in China. That's what the Navy did over there at that time. And he heard about it and he applied for naval aviation. After a while, he didn't hear anything about it, so he went in to speak to his commanding officer. And the officer took him into a stateroom and reached in the desk drawer and said, "Here's your application, Bob. I didn't put it in." He said, "Why in the world would a promising young officer like yourself want to ruin his career by going into some of this nonsense?" And Hickey said at that point, "This is the future and I want to do it." So they put his papers through and he went on and he flew in 24 and 25. He later went on after his career, after his starting flight there, he went on and he became the skipper of the USS Hancock, which you'll hear about pretty soon. So he was the skipper of the Hancock. He was the first skipper to take it to sea, picked it up in Virginia out of the shipyard, drove it around to the Philippines. And then at the Hancock, let's go to the next slide. This is the USS Hancock. This is the ship I served on 22 years after he was there. So that's a connection, and we identified that right away and established that connection, and so that's been a big part of our relationship, is sharing that connection that goes back to the USS Hancock. The Hancock participated in a number of significant battles. You'll see some of them listed there, and it won the nickname of the Fighting Hannah and won a number of commendations, and so he saw some very good service. It was actually attacked once by a kamikaze, but they managed to shoot the plane up before it landed, and pieces of it landed on the deck. So there was some damage done to the ship, but the kamikaze attack really didn't succeed on the ship. After his term on the Hancock, Robert Hickey went on and eventually retired as a vice admiral after being assigned as a diplomatic attaché in London, and went on to a diplomatic career there. But that was, in the end of it, he retired as a vice admiral, so he achieved a pretty high rank. Okay, you'll notice on this thing, I don't know if we mentioned the number, the displacement on the Langley, which is the weight of the ship, was 13,000 tons. If you look at the Hancock now, you'll see that instead of the 548 feet length, this thing's 888 feet long, and it's 93 feet wide, and the displacement on this is about 27,000 tons. So that's quite a bit bigger than what you saw before. So keep those numbers in mind. We'll talk about them further on. Let's go to the next slide. Excuse me. Okay, this is looking at the angle deck, and that's an innovation that took place in about 1953-54. They converted the Hancock, which was a straight deck built just like the Langley, into an angle deck. The significance of that is when you're landing on a straight deck, every time you come in, the plane's got to get caught by the cables, which are the arresting cables, and you got to stop because there are airplanes parked up ahead of you, and if you don't stop, you're going to run into them. So the Langley and all straight deck carriers had 13 cables there in a row, spaced roughly 10 feet apart, and you had 13 cables that you could catch, and behind that there was a net, so that if you missed all 13 of the cables, you'd go into the net. And that was a mess because then they had to untangle you from the net before the next airplane could land. So that was a big deal. The angle deck, which you're looking at here, only has 4 cables. And these things are cover a total span of about 40 feet on the deck, and that's where you have to land. You got to hit the deck within 40 feet because you're dragging a tail hook behind you, and that tail hook's got to catch one of those 4 wires to stop you. If you miss, you just add your power and go around and try again, and that's called a bolter. And it means that you missed the cables and you landed and you didn't catch anything, and so you put your power on and you go fly around again. One of the things, and what this means is that a carrier landing is different from any kind of other airplane landing. If you land on a runway,
you'll notice that the pilot always flares the plane a little bit to soften the landing. Well, if you do that, you never know where you're going to touch down. And you got to know, because you got to hit within 40 feet in order to stop on this thing. So a Navy landing is really a controlled crash. What you do is you come up, aim for the ship, and fly till you hit it. That's a Navy landing, okay? And it gets pretty exciting sometimes. The other things that you have to watch are the center line. You got to be lined up, and you got to be within 2 feet of that center line either direction, because if you're more than 2 feet off, the cable is going to pull you to the side. If you catch a cable, it's going to pull you to the side, which is not good. And you got to be right on glide slope. And if you see this thing, you can see what we call the mirror. It's the optical landing system on the left side of the port side of the ship. It's a little bit hard to see here, but what that does is it projects a beam of light up that the pilot is looking at. And from that information, and I'll talk more about the optical landing system later, but that's what tells you that you're on the right approach to land on the ship. The other thing that you have to watch is you have a meter in the airplane that's called an angle of attack, and it tells you the position of the airplane in the sky as it's approaching. Those are the three things that are critical, because you got to be at the right angle of attack, or the mirror is not going to have you in the right position for your hook to catch the cable. So those are the three things that you're really paying a lot of attention to as you're coming in. And of course, you're shooting for a moving target too. I got curious about how accurate you had to be, so I did a little calculation here, and I figured that basically what you're doing is you're trying to fly your head through a window that's about 5 feet by 5 feet, and you're going 150 miles an hour, and it's moving. So that tells you something about the accuracy with which you have to approach in order to get on board here. Another interesting fact here is that this angle deck, which you see here, it covers a little over half the length of the ship. It also happens to be about 500 feet long. So that's the Langley. You can park the Langley right there, and that's basically what it would be.
Are there two decks then?
Are there what?
Are there two landing strips here or two runways on this?
No.
No, that's the center line of the ship, the center line of the angle of the deck area. You're looking at the center line and the two sidelines. Okay, so you got to hit the center line. And the perfect thing is to get your nose wheel on that landing, on that center line. And when you stop, when the cable stops you, you want your nose wheel right on that center line. That means you had a well-aimed landing there.
Oh, I see. The angle is, okay, I got it.
And the angle, you know, the ship is going this way and the angle goes this way. So you're coming in, you're crossing the path of the ship really to land on this thing. Okay. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is another picture of the, what is that? That's
Hancock.
That's the Hancock. Okay. Well, you'll notice the displacement is on here on this slide. I think I can't see any of these slides, by the way. So if you can read something there, I can't read it, but there's a lot of information there. But like I said, there's no test, so we'll move on. Okay. This is what the deck, and the deck you can see, I think you can see the 4 wires on this, and if you look on the left, you can see the mirror over there, and you should see a horizontal green line of green lights, and you may see an orange light in the middle. That's what we call the meatball, and that's the line of sight, and it should be lined up with those green lines. We had 3 elevators on this thing to go down to the hangar deck, and I'll show you the hangar deck and the flight deck later on. And then there are 2 catapults up on the front. When the ship was refurbished in 53 and 54, converted to an angle deck, they put in steam catapults, and those were the first steamer catapults in the Navy, I think. And then they also put in the optical landing system on this deck at that time. Prior to that time, they had a landing signal officer that would be standing out there with paddles or lights in his hand, and he'd be waving and signaling like this to tell you how to come down. If he wanted you to go up, he'd do the paddles up, and if you wanted to go down, he'd put the paddles down, and if he wanted you to get out of there, he'd wave them like this, and that was how you did it. Okay, so go to the next one. These are just 2 ships because we like to aviators like to look at carriers in the water. And this is our latest carrier, which is the Gerald R. Ford on the left, and it's a Nimitz class carrier. So you can kind of see the difference between that and the Langley. Let's go to the next one. Okay, and this is just another picture of carriers, and that is the Kitty Hawk in the back, which was a class. The first ship in any size or design is called, the class is named after that. So there was a Kitty Hawk class, and that's the Gerald R. Ford, our latest carrier. The Kitty Hawk was actually on duty in the Pacific when I was out there, so we were out there at the same time. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is the USS Enterprise, and it was the first nuclear carrier, and it came on duty, I think, in 61 is what it said here. Notice the displacement. The displacement on this thing now is 93,000 tons. The Hancock was about 27, and the Langley was 13. So that's what's happened, and you'll notice the same kind of growth in the aircraft. We'll look at some of the aircraft statistics. So you see things get bigger and faster and stronger, and that's the pattern. And they also get a lot more expensive, and we'll talk about that too. All right, go to the next one here. Okay, this is a carrier, and it's a fun picture to look at because you wouldn't think carriers would behave like that, but this is something that they do during sea trials. They take it out and with no airplanes on it, and you can see why. This is what's called a hard turn to port. So what they do is get the thing going full speed and turn it as hard as they can to the port, and I guess they do starboard as well. But this is sea trials, and it's a fun picture to look at. I was never on anything that did anything like that. Okay, so go to the next one. Okay, this is a little better picture of the landing. You see the angle deck. Okay, now you can definitely see the mirror over on the left. You'll notice this is a bigger carrier because there are airplanes parked out to the left of the landing area. We couldn't do anything like that on the Hancock, so that's a result of a bigger ship. The other thing that you might notice on here is if you look at the center line of the landing area and look at the back end of the ship, there's a line of lights that hang straight down from there. And those are called the drop lights. And they're there for night landings because it's very important that you be lined up properly. And I told you that. Okay, but at night, that's kind of hard to tell. So what they did is they put these drop lights on there. And if you are right on line, the drop lights and the center line lights of the landing area will be a straight line. If you're a little bit off, there's a break in the line right there. So there's an angle. And it gives you a visual clue that you're not lined up exactly right. And you need all the clues you can get. So that's what that's about. I don't know that there's anything else about this slide in particular to tell you, but you notice a lot of airplanes parked on the flight deck there. What happens when you land is you land and the cable stops you, and you'll see that. We're going to have a video later on, and you'll see the impact. When the cables catch you, it throws you forward in the seat. And what you do as soon as you hit the deck, this is in a jet, the first thing you do is pull in your speed brakes and put your power up to 100% because you need that to go around again in case that's what happens. Okay, so as soon as you hit the deck, you put your power on, your speed brakes in, and you get ready for takeoff. If the cables stop you, then they'll pull you back. When you start going back, you pull the power back, reduce the power, you pull your speed brakes in, you step on the left brake, and you look to the right because there's somebody standing over there with some lights or paddles or something. He's waving at you like this, telling you, come this way, get out of the way, because there's another airplane coming behind you. Okay, and these things land about a minute apart. So you got to get out of there. Okay. So all of this stuff happens fast, okay? Everything's moving at a very fast pace.
Where are the catapults?
The catapults are up on the front, and this ship had two just on the front. I mean, the Hancock, I don't know what ship that was. The Hancock had two catapults on the front. And interesting, on my first cruise, I was in the junior officer quarters up there. There were four of us in the room. We were right underneath the catapults, and I was in the upper bunk. And when they were launching and I was in the bunk, every time that thing went off, I felt like I was bouncing out of the bunk. So that was part of my adventure in the first cruise there. The second cruise was a little bit better. We were in a room down below, and the air conditioner for the wardroom was bolted to the top metal deck. So when that was running, you couldn't hear yourself think in our room. So this is not the kind of cruise where you go out and lay around on the deck reading novels or anything. There's no swimming pool or bar, anything like that. But it was a cruise. Okay, this is a diagram of a carrier. All the carriers are basically the same. A carrier is a 16-story building floating on the water. Okay, the principal deck is the hangar deck, and the deck is open from the bow to the stern, so it's open all the way through the ship. And you'll see that's deck number 1. Counting down, you go down to 8. So there's 2 through 8. All of those decks are watertight. Okay, so everything below the hangar deck is watertight. And then the levels up above that are called levels, not decks. And you go 0, 1 through 0, 8. Okay, 03 is the flight deck. Okay, so we shuffle planes between the hangar deck and the flight deck. My whole life on the ship was basically lived between deck 2 and level 04. I never got to any other part of the ship. So as the aviation detachment, that's what we were interested in. That's where we lived, and that's what we saw. Okay, next. Okay, this is the Navy Wings of Gold, and every naval aviator is very proud of these things. You'll see what the requirements are. And, you know, there are height and weight requirements, physical condition requirements, academic requirements, and so on. It does not say anything about being handsome, but it doesn't say anything about having arms and legs either, and you had to have those. Okay, so certain things were just understood and didn't need to be spelled out. So. Okay, let's go. Okay, now I'm going to take you through, give you an idea of what training to become a naval aviator is like. I went to Pensacola, Florida in February of '67, and I did not go in with a commission. They didn't have a naval ROTC at Texas A&M where I went to school. So I went in, and I went into what's called the Aviation Officer Candidate Program. It was a boot camp and a training camp. So we met the Marine drill sergeants there, and boy, were they fun. So anyway, we had that traditional experience. While we were in classes, we studied aerodynamics and weather and things like that. And then we ran the obstacle course and heard stories of how great the Marines were in battles. And one was instructed to teach us history, and his history consisted of listing all the places where the Marines went around and beat the hell out of everybody. So that was his understanding of what history was about. Anyway, after that was about 16 weeks. Then I got my commission then and became a commissioned an ensign, and then went into flight training. This was the first plane we flew. So the Beechcraft T-34. And I wound up with about, I think it was 32 hours in this thing of flight training. I soloed in this, and once we got past all that, I then just transferred into jet training. And the next plane I flew was the T-2. I think it was called the Buckeye. I was in Meridian, Mississippi, and I got over 100 hours in this. We did basic flight training. We did aerobatics. We did some instrument training and so on. And then toward the end of that, we transferred back down to Pensacola, and we went through carrier training. So we'd go out and practice landing on a carrier. Now, we had to do a lot of practice, obviously, to do that. And we flew, there were a lot of little airfields scattered around the Panhandle in Florida. And that's where we would go. And we always had to get up about daylight, because in that part of the country, if you were flying later in the day, the thermals made the sky so rough that you couldn't really practice anything as precise as a carrier landing. So we had to be out there right after daylight while the air was still calm and cool and still. And so we'd get up and go fly to these airfields, and they simulated a mirror there with a couple of boards. They had a couple of billboards out there. One was 2 billboards with a break in the middle, and another billboard mounted behind there. The 2 billboards had a line simulating the green lights, and the other one had a line, and you had to get on the line where these things made one continuous line through the billboards. And that's how we practiced. And we'd go out and fly multiple, what you call touch and goes, go down to make a landing, take off, come around. We'd go out and do 5 or 6 of those and come back and then get ready for the next day. So that's how we practiced. And then I went to the USS Lexington, which was another Essex class ship. That's the class ship that the Hancock was. So it was a sister ship to the Hancock. And I got 4 carrier traps, which is what we call a carrier landing. 4 traps on that thing, and that qualified me as a naval aviator. It qualified me as a carrier pilot at that point. I've never forgotten my first catapult shot. We flew out there and we landed on the deck. I said, oh boy, that's great, I'm down. And then they taxied me up and put me on the catapult, and they went through. Now, what you do on the catapult, what you do is you taxi up on the catapult, and they put the blast deflector up behind you because you're going to run your engines up. You look over, they'll hook you up to the catapult. You look over at the launch officer, and you'll see that later on, and he'll be giving you a signal like this. It says, rev it up. So you take it up to 100% power. You check all your instruments. When you're ready, you salute, and then he pushes the button and fires you off. When he did that, I felt like my knees came up in my face because I was not braced. I was not expecting anything like that. And my eyes got about this big, I think, but I couldn't tell that. So the next time I went, for my second time, I was much more firmly braced, but I've never forgotten that first catapult shot. That was a real experience. Okay, this is after, and we did a little gunnery training too, which meant that the plane would go out there and drag a banner behind it, and then we'd go in and try to shoot holes in the banner. So that was fun. We enjoyed that. After that, I transferred to Kingsville, Texas, and went into advanced flight training. They had two bases, Kingsville and Beeville, where we did advanced flight training. By the way, we trained with Marines here too. So all the Marine pilots were in the training with us at the same time here going through flight training. They had each of these bases, they had 2 squadrons of F9s, which is what this is, and a squadron of F11s, which you'll see here too. And we went through basically all the same flight training, except we did a lot more instrument flight training, which is a different experience. What they do for that is, I mean, you go through a lot of simulators to learn basic instrument training, but then when you go out on a flight like this, they put you in the back seat, put a hood over your head so you couldn't see anything outside, and say, okay, you're in control. And you flew the plane there on whatever your flight plan was. The next plane then is the F-11. This was an afterburner. It was a jet with an afterburner. It was my only time in an afterburner, and the significance of that, I got to go supersonic. But I found when I took a flight out to do my supersonic flight, and I couldn't get it to go supersonic until I started going down. So I aimed it toward the ground with the afterburner going, and when I got to 10,000 feet, I said, whoa, this is enough of this. And so I pulled up and became subsonic again. Going supersonic is like a nothing experience. You don't feel anything different when you go through the sound barrier. There's no barrier there that you feel. All that refers to is the sound wave that you're making as you cross over the ground. So there's no sensation of going supersonic. There's nothing like that at all. So you're just going faster is all. And you look on the meter and you can see it. Okay, go to the next one. After that, and we did carrier quals, I got 3 carrier landings in the F9, by the way. So I got about 25 hours of flight time in the F11. After that, I was then transferred to more, well, first things, I got my wings. Now I'm a Naval Aviator. So that was a big deal. And there was a whole ceremony at graduation. My folks came down, my uncle and aunts came in. So that was a celebration. That was really something special. So then I was transferred to NAS Lemoore outside of Fresno, and we went through fleet training. So at that point now I knew I'd flown these other airplanes. I now had to learn how to fly the A4. So I went through the A4 training. I think I got about 95 hours. I'm not sure of that. And we went through all the traditional training. We did a lot more bombing training and weapons delivery training, obviously, because now that was a big part of what we were getting ready for. And then after a few months of that, I graduated from that squadron and went into my squadron that I was going to serve in, which was VA-216, which signifies an attack squadron, and the number was 216, 216, and the nickname of that was the Black Diamonds. So you may see reference to the Black Diamonds. You'll see the Black Diamond logos up here on the master slide in the upper left corner and the upper right, and those things are on display over here. You can look at them on the table, but that was our logo for the plane. We later changed to a simpler logo because that was too much work to paint it on the plane, but that was what we decorated everything with. The only significance here is looking at the cockpit. The principal instrument that you see in the cockpit's in the middle there. It's called the artificial horizon, and that was just a visual indicator that told you what position your plane was in the air. And this was really handy when you were flying and couldn't see outside. It was also very handy if you were flying between clouds. I remember one time flying in a flight, and this was peacetime. I was just flying around in the U.S., and I felt like I was sitting sideways, leaning the whole time, but that thing said I was straight and level, and it's because the clouds were lower on one side than they are on the other, and it gave me a visual sense of being flying like this, and I wasn't. I was flying straight. So that's a very handy tool. In the cockpit there, we had a checklist that you went through before every takeoff. My recollection is there were 81 items on that thing that you checked over every time you went out to take off, and you knew that thing by heart. Okay, we always went through the checklist. We had a card anyway, and you went through the checklist. So, okay, next. Okay, this is an A4. This is actually a sister plane. This was 212, and you can see it's missing part of the rudder. The tail hook is down because the hydraulic system was damaged, and you see some damage up on top of the aircraft, just above the wings there. The significance of this is that this was a sturdy little airplane, and it was able to fly after it had been hit and damaged, and that really paid off. Plus, it's also a pretty small airplane. I didn't mention the dimensions, but this thing is about 40 feet tip to tail and 26-foot wingspan. So remember that 26-foot wingspan. This was a small enough airplane that our nickname for it was the Tinker Toy. So the official nickname of this plane was the Skyhawk, but we did call it a Tinker Toy as well. And but it was a sturdy little airplane that would keep flying even if it got hit. And this is one returning. I don't know the story of what happened to this guy, whether he was able to land successfully or not. But that was our sister squadron, so I don't know when that picture was taken. Okay. This is the attack squadron missions. We had 3 missions as attack pilots. We had close air ground support, and we had ground attack, and we had nuclear weapons. Every pilot had a nuclear target assigned. Okay, the close air support, we flew primarily in South Vietnam, and the way we do that, we'd load up whatever weapons were assigned for that flight. We'd fly into a designated point somewhere, and we'd get in radio contact with the forward air controller. This was a guy who was flying around in a Cessna and talking to the ground troops. And when we made radio contact with him, he would fly somewhere near where he wanted the weapons, and he'd throw a smoke bomb out the window. And the smoke bomb would go down and land on the ground, and then it would, as it smoked, it would make a column of smoke, which we could see. And he would then use that column of smoke to direct our attention. He talked in terms of kilometers, so he'd say, okay, you see the smoke, 2 clicks north of that, there's a river, and there's a line of trees on the north side of that river. Put your weapons there. And so we'd line up and drop whatever weapons we were carrying on that line of trees. That's how we did close air ground support. The weapons that we carried were basically 250-pound bombs, but we also occasionally carried napalm, and we had some canisters that were basically hand grenades. You're basically dumping a barrel full of hand grenades on the ground, and these things had little tail fins on them that would give air resistance and scatter them out. So you'd basically be scattering hand grenades on the ground. This was an anti-troop weapon. And we had some rockets that we could fire. And we had also, we had guns on the plane, but we knew they were not very accurate. It's 20-millimeter cannon, and we could use those, and we would occasionally strafe, but we never really believed we were going to hit anything with those things. On the ground attack, we were basically attacking facilities of some kind, buildings or any kind of transportation, bridges, anything like that. Those were our basic targets. Those were assigned ahead of time, and we would have a specific payload that we were carrying out to put out there, and we would go out headed for that target, you know, knowing where we were going and flying. We would normally, started later flying in higher. At first, we were going in fairly low at about 7,000 or 8,000 feet, and then we started going in higher later on to change in tactics. We also had a weapon, a guided weapon called a bullpup, and what you did with that thing, you'd fly. We were dive bombing, so what we would do is we would go in at about 7,000 feet, and then basically at a 30-degree angle, we would dive down, aiming at the target, release our bombs at a certain point, pull up, which would be roughly 1,000 feet. And that was the way we delivered our weapons. If you were doing napalm, we do it at a 10-degree angle. So there was a little bit difference in depending on what kind of weapon you were delivering. We had a bullpup, which you would use for things like bridges or something where you really wanted to be careful what you hit. And the bullpup was something that you would fire. You'd carry one and fire it off, and then you had to fly along following it and controlling it with the button on your stick to keep it flying toward the target. So you'd guide that in, but it wasn't a real smart weapon. It was just doing what you told it. And so that was the most sophisticated. We also had something called a Gatling gun that was in a big can. A Gatling gun is about 7 barrels. I think it was 7 barrels, and they would fire in rotation, so you get a very high rate of fire. And we had one of those that we carried a couple of times, but no one in the squadron got a chance to fly it but the skipper, because every time that was assigned for a mission, he took that plane. And I'm told that when that thing went off, the recoil on it was such that felt like the plane was stopping in midair. I'm sure that's an exaggeration, but you know, exaggeration is part of the game. So the nuclear delivery, let me talk about that a little bit. Every pilot had a nuclear mission assigned to them, and you knew where it was. Mine happened to be a power plant that I think was a couple of 100 miles inside China. And the plan was you'd go in flying below the radar. So we practiced those missions flying at 100 feet off the ground. And what you would do is you'd take strip maps and you'd cut them so that you had a folded map on your knee pad, and you could just fold that map as you went from one thing to another. What you would do is fly into the coast to a designated point, pick up a visual. You'd have a heading and an airspeed and a time that you would fly. So you'd get at 100 feet, you'd be flying a certain direction, and you'd fly for 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever it was, and you'd be looking for something on the ground. It might be a building on a mountainside, it might be a bridge, a river crossing, it might be a fork in a river, whatever it was. That was your visual checkpoint. At that point, you had a new heading and time to fly. And we had a map that took us all the way into the target. When you reached the designated point for the delivery, what you would do is you would pull up at a designated speed and you'd make a loop. You'd go over the top and turn and head for the coast. At a certain point in the delivery there, you'd release the weapon and you'd basically lob it to go over and land. So the nuclear weapon would be going this way and you'd be going this way and turning and heading for the coast as fast as you could, hoping you're getting away from that. When we did that, we were also hoping that there was going to be a ship there to land on it. We could find it and get back on board, but we never really knew for sure. My target was in China. I never knew where anybody else's target was. These were all top secret. But you had to be thoroughly briefed on that. And we may have had targets in Russia. We might have been close enough to have some targets in Russia, but mine was in China, and I made the assumption that all the rest of them were too, but that's an assumption. When we were off the coast of Vietnam, when we were flying into North Vietnam, we flew from what they called Yankee Station. We had 2 stations where the carriers would go out and stay. And Yankee Station was roughly between that island up there. You can see that was Hainan Island. It was roughly between that and the coast of Vietnam. And there'd be 2 carriers on duty there. This is second cruise. The first cruise wasn't like this. We weren't attacking much in North Vietnam then. But the second cruise, we would be flying round-the-clock missions. So there'd be 2 carriers up there, and they'd basically be flying 12 to 14-hour days. So they would start launching whenever their day began, and they'd go for 12 or 14 hours straight, continuously cycling. A cycle was about an hour and a half, so all the flights were about an hour and a half. So that was the fuel limit too. So everything was timed around that. So you go out and you'd launch whatever flight was going out. Okay, and then an hour and a half later, roughly an hour and a half, you'd launch the next set of planes, and when they were all gone, then you'd recover the ones that had been out. And that was the cycle, and they do that for 12 to 14 hours. And 24 hours a day, there were planes in the air from one or the other carrier. South Station, or Dixie Station, was about where the E is in Vietnam, and the carrier would be there. Sometimes it'd be 1, sometimes 2 carriers out there. But that's the way we rotated. A lot of times when we'd be coming out of the Philippines, where we did light maintenance in Subic Bay, you can see Subic Bay down there on the west coast of the Philippines, and we'd be in and out of there when we needed maintenance of any kind. And the way they do it, a lot of times they go out and put you on station, and we mostly started flying in the daytime and kind of slid the schedule, so we wound up flying at night. But it didn't really want to throw you out there flying at night after you've just been on relief on the base and not flying. Next slide. This is an F-14. I never had anything to do with this, okay? But it was in the first Top Gun. And so I wanted to put that in there because this whole presentation really was born with the idea because Top Gun came out and everybody was talking about Top Gun. So that's why we got to thinking maybe people would like to see about Navy aviation. This was a hot plane. I want you to notice the wingspan on this thing. If you can visualize, you could park an A4 on each one of the wings, okay? Wouldn't be very good aerodynamically, but it would fit. And so this was quite a bit bigger plane. If you notice the payload on this, the weight on this thing was about 10,000 pounds, which was not too different from the A4, but the payload was a lot bigger. So this thing would carry a lot more. This was a very good, and this is also supersonic, goes about Mach 2. 2.34, I think is what it says. The next picture is the FA-18. That plane is no longer flying in the fleet, but now the mainstay of the fleet is the FA-18. And this, you notice, is designated not F, but FA. What that means is that this plane is designed for a dual mission. It flies attack missions as well as fighter missions. It was originally built as a single-seater, and then they finally, and after flying it a while, they decided that they needed another seat in there and have a wet. So the fighter planes are now configured with 2 seats, and the back seat is a weapons officer, so all he does is control the weapons. But both planes will fly fighter or attack. And you'll notice also this is a much smaller and lighter plane than the F-14, which is the first time I've seen the planes got smaller instead of bigger. But this is the mainstay of the fleet right now. So when a ship goes out now, it'll frequently have 4 squadrons of FA-18s. They'll have two attack squadrons and 2 fighter squadrons. Then they'll have miscellaneous other squadrons as well, other detachments for various things. But that's the mainstay of what's on the ship. The next slide is, this is that's an FA-18. Okay, this plane is on the catapult, ready to go. And what he's done is the pilot has gone through looking at all, he's at 100% power. You see the blast deflector in the back there. It's a big flat plate that comes up out of the deck, and that's just to deflect the blast up so you're not blowing airplanes off the back of the ship. And so the pilot runs his power up to 100%, checks all his gauges. When he's ready to go, he salutes this officer here in the yellow. He's the launch officer. And when the pilot salutes him and says he's ready to go, then he starts looking at the front of the ship to see whether it's going up or down, because he doesn't want to fire you up when it's pointed toward the water, because he doesn't really want to launch the plane into the water. He wants it to go into the air. So he has to take that movement of the ship into account to call the exact moment when he's going to press the button. When he's ready to go, he'll reach down and touch the deck, and the enlisted guy that's got the real button is over there on the side watching, and that's what fires the catapult. The catapult goes off in about 150 feet or something, whatever. I don't know the exact distance, but you're going from 0 to 150 miles an hour in that space, and it's quite a ride. The other officer in the yellow shirt is an understudy. He's just learning how to be a launch officer. All of the deck crew is color-coded, by the way. People wearing yellow shirts were in charge of something. People wearing red shirts were part of the ordnance crew. People wearing blue shirts were the guys that push the airplanes around and help you get in and out of them and things like that. So there were different responsibilities on the flight deck, but everything was color-coded so you could look around and see who was doing what. Next picture. This is, I think this is an F-35, which is the newest plane. I think there are only 2 squadrons of these things in the fleet right now, but this is one that I'm told is beginning its role on the catapult. And you see some guys on the deck there. They were doing a last-minute check of the outside of the plane. So when the pilot goes to the plane, the first thing he does is walk around the plane and check everything. Then he gets into the plane and he checks everything from the inside. He moves all the controls around to make sure that the ailerons and the tail fins and everything are moving. Then he starts the engine and goes through another check of all the instruments to make sure everything looks good there. And then he's got his takeoff checklist, which he has to go through there. And then he goes up on the catapult and he goes up to 100% and he looks at all his instruments again. Okay. And that's what it takes before you get one of these things into the air. Okay. This is air refueling. These are A4s. And the plane in front is the same plane as all the others, but it's got a tank strapped to the bottom of it that has that hose equipment in it. The A4 carries fuel. It's got a small fuel tank behind the pilot in front of the engine. And then the wing itself is a fuel tank. It's called a wet wing. So that's part of where your fuel is. And then you'll notice there are 2 additional tanks on the planes there. Those are 250-gallon wing tanks that carry extra fuel. We didn't carry those in combat, but when you were flying around in the States, you'd fly with that kind of, and that extended your range a lot because you had a lot more fuel there. The refueling operation is that the tanker pilot will, if they're getting ready to refuel, he'll lower that hose and they'll go out. There's an articulated basket there that's got things that create drag on the, like fabric of some kind. And the wind speed opens the basket. The basket is about 12 to 18 inches, no more. And what you have to do then, you have to take that probe that's on the front of your plane and you fly up behind this plane, stick it in there, push forward enough to make a good seat. And then the pilot in the tanker will release the fuel and you take on a couple of 100 pounds of fuel, and then they'll turn that off, and then you back out and fly back. Okay, so it's a little tricky operation, but it's not all that hard. The next picture, this is a drone flying the tanker, and I heard one of my friends say, "Oh boy, no more tanker missions for the pilots," because the tanker mission on the ship, when you were flying the tanker, you would be the last plane to take off after all the other planes on that flight were airborne. Then the tanker would take off, and you'd go up and fly circles at 20,000 feet over the deck until they all came back. And then after all the planes that had gone out came back, then the tanker would come down and land. So you had about an hour and a half flight there where all you were doing was flying circles in the sky. One night I was flying circles in the sky up this was around South Vietnam, around the South Vietnam area, and Da Nang was just over on the horizon. So I'm sitting up there on a dark night looking around with nothing much to do, and I look over there and I see a fireworks display. Well, what it was the Vietnamese were shelling Da Nang there, and I could see the arc of the shells as they're coming in onto Da Nang and the explosions as they went off. So I had about an hour and a half show there and thinking, oh boy, I'm glad to go back to the ship and not go to Da Nang. So, okay, this is the optical landing system. And you can see the horizontal line of lights there. I think you might be able to see where the vertical lights are. And I'm going to show you a diagram that tells you a little bit more about this. But the really miraculous thing here is this thing is on a platform, which is a stabilized platform, so that it stays in one position while the ship is over here doing this. Okay, because you look at a big ship like the Carrier and you don't think it's going to move around that much, but sometimes in a rough sea, the tail of that thing will be doing like a figure 8 in space. So the back end of the ship is sometimes moving all over the place like this. But you can't let this move, because if it did, it would be waving the landing pattern all around at the end, and you'd never be able to stay on that. So this whole thing is stabilized. So quite a bit of engineering goes into this. The next slide is a diagram that shows you what that's all about. So you see the green lights on a horizontal line. You see the vertical line of lights. They're orange and yellow here. I never saw a yellow light, but it's always looked orange to me. But that's a Fresnel lens. And the way it works is that if you are up above the glide slope that orange line is projecting, then what you'll see is the light that's above it. And that's clearly not lined up with the green line, so it tells you that you're high. Okay, so that's how you know where you are, is that visual reference that you're looking at, and it tells you that you're right on the appropriate glide path, which is about a 3-degree glide slope. And you'll notice that the light up at the top of that vertical bar is white. If you see that, it means you're about to lose sight of the whole thing, and you're way too high. You're not ever going to land. And the bottom one is red. If you ever see that, you're in trouble. You better get out of there. If the landing signal officer sees anything that he thinks is wrong and he wants you to get out there, he'll press the button that he has in his hand called a pickle. And what that does is it turns off the vertical lights and it starts flashing those red lights. So if you're coming in and you see your meatball go off and all those red lights go off, but you pull in your speed brakes and go to 100% and get out of there and come around and try it again. There's something wrong, and there's no telling what it is. Could be bad deck conditions, could be something going on the deck. It could be that you were in a position that he didn't think you were going to make it or something, but that happens.
What are cut lights?
I'm sorry?
What are cut lights?
Cut lights? Does it say cut lights somewhere?
Yeah, the upper green lights.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah. That probably has to do with the LSO cutting the lights off. That's the only thing I can think of. I mean, the white light up there tells you that you're about to lose sight of the mirror because there's no light above that. But I don't really know what the cut light means. But that's a description of what the mirror is all about. We called it the mirror, even though it wasn't a mirror. It was a Fresnel lens. Okay. It's called the optical landing system. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is the diagram of the landing pattern that you go through when you come in on a daylight landing. Now, the planes would come in, you might be in a 4-plane division. 4 planes were called a division, and that was 2 sections, two planes each. So the division leader was the head of 4 planes, and then there was the third person in the flight was the section leader, and each had a wingman. The division leader and the section leader, there were 2 sections, each had a wingman. You'd fly in 4 planes coming in, lined up with the division leader in the lead, and the other 3 planes would be stacked down off of his right wing. And you'd come in with your tail hook down, indicating that you're coming in for a landing, and you'd fly a level pattern up the starboard side of the ship to the right of the ship so that you were just off where you could see the ship to your left. And you're coming in with an A4, you're flying 250 miles an hour. I say miles per hour is knots, 250 knots, which is 287 miles. A nautical mile, everything was done in nautical miles. A nautical mile is 6,170 feet, and a statutory mile is 5,280, and that's 15.5% difference. So that's the difference in speed. If I say miles per hour, it's because I've been on land too long. We always talked in knots. Okay, so you would come in, and when the lead plane passed the tower on the ship, he would make a sharp break, and you always did a sharp break because somebody might be watching and you wanted to look good. So it would be a sharp break to a 30-degree turn, and at that point you would you put your speed brakes out, lower your power a little bit, start slowing down. As you're coming around the turn, when you'd slow down enough, you'd lower your landing gear and put your flaps in order so that by the time you got on the downwind, you're configured for landing. In the A4, the division leader would brake, the second plane would count 2 seconds and brake, the next plane would count 2 seconds and brake. So in 8 seconds, you've made your brake and you're all coming around landing, and that spaced you out for the landing on the ship. So that's how you develop your space. You'd come around and you'd be slowing down. When you got at the 180 point there, which is a beam the back of the ship, you would then begin your turn, and again at 30 degrees, and you would start adjusting your speed and coming around looking for the mirror. So you have to fly down, coming around in a turn there, so that you're heading back in the same direction as the ship, but you've got to cross the wake because you got to be on the other side because you're landing at an angle. Okay, we're going to see this because we're going to show a video seeing what this looks like. So you'll see that. So when you see the video, you'll see the pilot coming in, and the video is called Turning All the Way because this guy broke early, and so he never flew the downwind. He just made one circle, 2 halves of the circle continuously. He was turning all the way. And you'll see that up here on the slide, it says 90-10. That's saying you're paying 90% of your attention to what's going on inside the cockpit and 10% looking outside. And you'll see that. You'll see the pilot looking inside the cockpit, and then occasionally you see him looking back to see where the ship is. Once you get to the point where you pick up the mirror, that completely changes. Your focus is on what you're seeing in front of you, not anything in the cockpit. The only thing you're interested in the cockpit is the angle of attack, and you're paying attention to that. Okay, so we'll go to the next one. This is the pilot. I don't know what kind of plane this is, but you'll see this guy going. So we'll start this, and you'll watch this, and you see the ship down on the left. You can see the wake, and I think you can see the ship a little bit up in the front. So let's start this approach. This takes about 43, 45 seconds. So again, everything's happening fast. Okay. There he goes. What he's been doing here, he's been checking to make sure his gear is down and his speed brakes are out, and he's getting his flaps adjusted, getting everything adjusted for landing. So that's happening while he's turning. Now he's presumably got everything set now. So the next thing you'll notice is you'll see the wake coming into view. That means he's crossing the wake, and then you'll see the wings level out. You'll see the horizon level out. And as he gets in closer, look for the mirror. You can see the mirror in this picture. You won't see it for very long. Of course, he can see it all the way, but you can't see it from the angle where the camera is. Bingo. You see him go forward. Now he's coming back, and he's looking to the right because he's looking to see where he's being taxied to because he's got to get out of the way because somebody else getting ready to do the same thing. Okay, the next one is a night landing. You're not going to see as much. Night. Okay, on a moonlight night or when there are stars and you can see, you actually have some idea. You get a visual, so you can see the horizon. You have a sense of up and down. On a dark night, you don't. On a dark night, it looks like what the slide looks like here. So let's go to the slide. Now, the pilot can actually see a little bit more than you can see here, so he can see the ship, but that's what you see at night, on a dark night. Okay, so let's start that. Now, when it closer, you'll start to see the line of the deck that you stand on, and you'll start seeing over there, and so watch for that. And you notice also you'll see the drop lights. You see the horizontal line at the back of the ship, horizontal lighted line there, and below that are the drop lights going down and helping you see that you're lined up properly. You made it. Yay. What we always said was a good landing was one the pilot could walk away from, and a great landing was one the plane would fly again.
Oh, my God.
All right, now we're just going to look at some pictures. This is the LSO platform. That's an FA-18 just off the rear. The LSO is a visual officer. He's doing all of this by eyesight, so he has to be out there for many hours watching planes land, and he's looking to see if you're in the right, if you're on the glide slope. He tell that by his experience. You can tell if the plane's in the right shape, in the right angle. There's also an angle of attack indicator on the front landing gear. It's just a little light signal there. It's got a red, yellow, and green light on it. It's just an indicator from the plane of what the angle of attack is. So he's got that as an extra aid, but he can tell by looking at the plane because he's familiar with all the planes. He knows what they're supposed to look like, and he can tell. He's also watching the deck conditions. So he's taking that all into account, and he's watching to see whether you're going to make it or not. And in his right hand is the pickle. If he presses that button, he's saying, no, go away, this is not working. And in his left hand, he's on the radio, and he's talking to you all the time. So he'll be talking to you and talking you down and making adjustments. Every landing is observed and noted by the landing signal officer, and after the recovery, he'll come around to the ready rooms and debrief every pilot on their landing. So he'll tell every pilot, okay, you were okay, no problems, or he'll criticize your landing. Anything that he saw that he didn't think was perfect, he'll tell you about it. And he goes to every ready room and tells every pilot what their landing looked like. Okay, the next picture is just the landing signal officer again, but you see a lot of other guys out there, and these are LSOs in training, because every squadron had an LSO that was out there learning how to do this. This is Air Forces. This was kind of a fun slide we came up, found the information. Everyone would know right away that the biggest Air Force in the world is a U.S. Air Force and the most powerful, so nobody's surprised at that. In the left column, it measures Air Forces by number of planes, but in the right column, it tells you by force. And I don't know what the formula is, but it clearly includes its destructive power of the weapons. And you'll notice that the top two Air Forces, most powerful Air Forces in the world, are the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy. And you'll notice that out of the top 7, 4 of the most powerful Air Forces in the world are U.S. The Russians are in there, and then the Chinese and Indians are down at the bottom. So that's just a little interesting slide there.
What happened to the Marines?
This is, okay, this was a mission that I had. We were going on my first cruise going to Hawaii. One of the things we had to do was go flat target practice and practice dropping bombs. We had 25-pound bombs that we go out and drop on a target range on the island of Molokai, which you can see on there. So this other pilot and I took off. I was flying his wing. He was an experienced pilot from the cruise before. And we went out and we dropped our bombs, and as we're taking off to head back to the ship, the normal procedure is to do a join up at that time so that we're flying formation. And the way you do that is you both make a 30-degree turn. You're flying behind him. You make a 30-degree turn, and as you go around that turn, the circles bring you together. The purpose of that is that you're both flying 250 knots. And so when you get close to him, you're going basically the same speed he is. And it's an easy adjustment to get into position. If you had to fly at 300 miles an hour to catch up to him, then you're going to get up close to him. You got some speed adjustments you have to make, and it's very tricky. So the way you put planes together in the air is through this standard kind of turn. He didn't do that. He kept going straight. So after a while, I'm flying out behind him trying to catch up, and I looked at the cockpit or something, I don't know, but I lost sight of him. I looked back up, I couldn't see him because there's not much to look at when you're looking at the back of an A4. So I got on the radio to tell him, and nothing happened. So I figured, I don't have a radio. So I looked down at my TACAN, which is an instrument you have in the plane that has a compass rose on it that wrote the face of the thing rotates and tells you what direction you're going. There's a needle that points to the station you're tuned to. And if you're going to the station, then the needle and the compass rose should line up facing forward. And it's got a rotating dial that tells you how far away it was. Well, my needle was making circles and the rotating dials were rolling over, so I didn't have any navigation either. So I'm flying here by myself looking at the Pacific Ocean. I got to 20,000 feet, started looking around saying, well, let me see where the wake of the ship is. I didn't see it. What I got was a beautiful view of the Pacific and nothing else. And at 20,000 feet, I'm thinking, what comes next? So after a while, I figured, well, there's not much future in this. I'm headed for Kaneohe, which is a military base up there on Oahu. And I think Kaneohe is marked there. But I'm not sure where it is. I know generally where it is. So I head in that direction. I start thinking about my fuel. How far away is it? Well, I had a couple of those fuel tanks on. So at some point I said, okay, these are creating drag and I don't need them. There's no fuel in them. So I dropped them into the ocean and I still don't have anything. I've tuned into Kaneohe just in case. And I'm looking back, the only land I see is the island of Hawaii because there's a volcano there. It's a big island. And I'm starting to think, well, what am I going to, should I go over there and fly back and forth hoping somebody sees me before I have to jump out of this thing? And about that time, I look at my TACAN and the needle is starting to slow down a little bit. Next thing I know, it focuses in and I say, oh, that's where Kaneohe is. And I'm headed the right direction. So now I got that and I look at the dial and it's still rotating, but it's slowing down too. Pretty soon it gives me a distance. As soon as I get that, I look at my fuel and say, oh, I'm okay. So then I go ahead and I fly into Kaneohe. I make a no radio approach, which is flying down over the runway, looking at the tower. They know I'm coming in out of nowhere. And as I go by the tower, I waggle my wings and they say, that's a no radio signal. So the tower shoots a green light at me. It says, you're cleared to land. So I go around and land, go into operations, call the ship and tell them where I am. Next slide. This was my first combat mission. We were flying in to bomb a barracks. I think it's called Dong Ha, and this was just in north of the DMZ, which put it into North Vietnam. We were flying, this is the first cruise, and this was February the 7th, 1965. I've never forgotten that date. And we were basically flying retaliation raids. We weren't flying regular operations, but the Vietnamese would do something we didn't like, bombing some of our people or something. And so we'd say, okay, we're going to retaliate. So that's where they'd schedule a raid. So we went in and we went in low. We went in about 7,000 feet here and I felt something hit the plane. I felt the bump, but at that altitude, the air can be very bumpy and sometimes you feel like you're going down a corrugated road or something. So I just blew it off and figured, well, the plane's still flying, so there's nothing much. So I kept on flying. We went and did the mission, went back to the ship. When I came around to land, I started my turn to the mirror and the plane felt a little funny, but it was still flying okay. So I took it easy and came around carefully and got it on board. When I got out, all the deck crew was buzzing around the plane. So I got out and walked back and said, what's going on? And they showed me this. So I had been hit. And I was fortunate the hit had taken out a couple of the hinges on the aileron, but it had not hit the fuel tank. Remember, it's a wet wing. So this hit behind the fuel tank. So I was very lucky, and it's good to be lucky. I'm only alive because of that. Okay. This slide is some of the losses that we took. Okay, you see the name Scott Chrisman there. He was my roommate, one of my roommates. There were 4 of us in the JO officers' quarters up there. We were practicing some night landings, and he had bolted a couple of times on a night landing. Interesting thing is there's a camera in the flight deck that points up the glide path. And so we're sitting in the ready room watching. You can watch all the planes come in, and it's focused in such a way there's crosshairs. So if the pilot's right where he's supposed to be, the plane's in the crosshairs. So as the plane's coming in, we could see him going high, and then he'd go low, and then he'd go high, and he'd fly off the screen because he had to go around. And he did that a couple of times, so he's coming in for the third try. And, you know, he's running out of gas. So he wants to get down. So we could see him going high, and then we could see him going low. We're all yelling, oh, laughing, carrying. Come on, Scott, pull it up. And next thing you know, there's a big fireball. And the plane hit about halfway on the back end. I saw something come flying up out of the fireball. That was the front end of the airplane, the cockpit. And he was in the cockpit on the flight deck when I went up there. The back of the plane was jammed in the back of the ship, so they had to clear that off. All the other planes in the air flew into Da Nang that night and flew back to the ship the next day because there was no more recovery. That was our first loss. The second guy there is Tom Mino, and we were flying in the Philippines just on a routine night flight. We had gone, just practicing missions. So we'd gone out and we were flying. I flew down over the southern island, and I remember seeing the volcano down there. There's a lake within a volcano that's within a lake that's within another volcano. It's kind of a spectacular view. So that's what I saw on that flight. We came back to land and we made the approach. I came into the ready room, looked around and said, where's Tom? And they said, we don't know. The only thing they could figure was he disappeared from the radar at the exact point where he should have been at 1,000 feet. And we didn't have a radar altimeter. All we had was a barometric altimeter, and it was somewhat easy to misread. And the only conclusion they could ever draw was he had misread his altimeter and was at sea level when he thought he was at 1,000 feet, because that's exactly where he disappeared. That's all we ever knew about that. Ray Voden was shot down on another mission that I was on, and he went down and parachuted out. And as we flew around getting ready to leave the area, I saw him standing on the hillside. He then spent about 7 years in prison. He wrote a book about it, which is mentioned here. So there is a book about his experience in prison. And he came back to the States in '72 when they got the prisoners back. And then he was at some of our reunions, and we had a chance to get together with him. And he got another wife and by that time. And so he did okay. And then Paul Galani was shot down on our second cruise, and he spent about 6 years in prison. And Paul Galani is in our group now and meets with me every Sunday afternoon, once a month. We have a Navy group that gets together, and Paul Galani's in that group. Next slide. These are some pictures of pages in my logbook. And you know, you saw 4 guys in personal stories, but if you look in the logbook, there are places there where I noted where other pilots had gone down. So we were losing a number of people here. This was in the second cruise. So if you see the names of people written on those pages, those were guys that went down. Most of them I didn't even know. These were guys in other squadrons, okay? Those other 4 were in our squadron. There are a couple of names mentioned here. Baldwin is mentioned there. He was on a flight up in the north part of North Vietnam, and it was one of those places there was a lot of ground, a lot of defensive fire. He got hit. His plane was on fire. He headed for the coast as fast as he could to get out over the water where he could be picked up. But then he jumped out going at 400 miles an hour. And when he did, the wind blast took his arms and legs and pulled all of them out of their sockets. Okay, but he fell. The ejection seat took care of that and opened his parachute and everything. They picked him up out of the water. And he's also in our reunion group. So, and he jumped out of 2 planes. That was one plane, but this was the worst one. When they brought him in, after they picked him up, he looked like a rag doll. They took him down into the medical area. There's a guy named Bill Eisenhower there who carried a Pearl Handle 45. He was kind of a cowboy. And on one of these missions here, he shot himself in the leg, so he never lived that down. And then there's another guy down there named Haglund. And Paul Haglund was scheduled to fly on our last launch of the mission, and probably the last Navy flight that he would ever take, because he was going to get out and do something else. And on that last flight, it was a night flight, and I was the duty officer sitting in the ready room. He was my section leader, by the way. I flew on his wing during the second cruise. So I said goodbye to him in the ready room. He went out and launched, and seemed like about 10 or 15 minutes later, he came in dripping wet, carrying his flight gear. Said, what happened? Well, as he was going down the catapult, something broke loose and was breaking up his plane. He lost the lights. The plane was failing. Right off the catapult, he ejected. And they picked him up right away, and he was back in the ready room in what seemed like just a very few minutes. He's also in my Navy group. Okay. So that's what was going on. This is Paul Galani on Life magazine in '67, and you see he's shooting the bird, but the Vietnamese didn't know what that meant, so they let the picture pass. But that's a picture of a Vietnam veteran, and he was showing his defiance. Okay, the next slide. This is the War Memorial, no, yeah, that's the War Memorial. And Paul's wife, Phyllis, was very active in the wives movement to get the people out of prison camp. And so they're recognized in the War Memorial here in Virginia. They've got a Paul and Phyllis Galeni section of that thing. That's in Richmond, Virginia. She's gone now, but they had 2 sons after he got back. So he had he came back in good shape. This is in my logbook, some notations where I just summarized my first and second cruise, and it just tabulated the number of landings, night landings, carrier landings, day and night, and combat missions, and the date and time of the cruise. So you can see the cruises were about 8 months long on ship. Next. Wow. This is what is it?
Qualifications.
Oh, this is by qualifications. This is just a qualifications page out of my logbook. And you just see some of the qualifications that we went through in early flight training. Of course, you see the stamp in there where my carrier qualifications were noted. So that's just a page out of the logbook. Then the next picture is my last assignment. We were losing A4s in Vietnam, and they had a bunch of old A4s parked out in Davis-Monthan in the desert for dry storage. And they were bringing 25 of them back that were being rebuilt, refurbished, and they needed a test pilot to fly it. And the period just coincided with the few months I had left in the service. And so in October of '66, I was transferred to the Defense Contract Administration Service Office facility at the Tulsa Airport. So on one side of the airport was the commercial terminal. On the other side was this facility. All the other people there were Air Force pilots. They were flying B-52s and B-47s. And I was the only pilot there flying this thing. So I was flying a little plane and going out to the runway and lining up behind 737s, B-52s, B-47s. So I was a bit of a celebrity. They noticed me there. Okay, so the next slide is, this is our officer picture in the first cruise. That's all the officers that were in this squadron. Next picture is all the enlisted guys. So that's the size of a squadron, basically equally divided between officers and enlisted. Most of the officers were pilots. We also had an air intelligence officer. We had a couple of maintenance officers there who were non-pilots. But all of the rest of the guys in the squadron were pilots.
What was the racial composition of those groups?
Everybody's white. There were no racial. I saw one black officer the whole time I was in the Navy, which was 5 years, and he was a backseat officer who, for some reason, had landed on the Hancock. So I had a chance to visit with him, but he was the only black officer that I saw in the whole time in the Navy. Of course, women didn't exist.
What about the enlisted?
The enlisted were all mixed ranks. We had lots of different races in the enlisted ranks. So we had a lot of black guys there, and we had black chiefs too. So we had people who had achieved rank, but they were all in the enlisted ranks. Now, there were black officers in the Navy at that time, but there were none where I was. So I didn't see any. So it was not a racially mixed. I mean, the enlisted ranks were very well mixed. We had lots of black guys there, and lots of black guys that got, and other races too. I mean, but you know, they advanced in the ranks and made chief positions and, you know, achieved rank. So that they did better there. But it was a racial environment. There's no doubt. This was my second cruise, and I'm on all the way over on the right, squatting down there. Next picture. This is a promotion ceremony. There are 7 people in there. 5 of them are in my Navy group, meets once a month. The guy standing up on the right side of this picture is Smokey Talbert. And he went on to become a Blue Angel, and then went back overseas, was shot down, and his remains were recovered. He was from Tishomingo, Oklahoma, and we went up for a ceremony. A bunch of us got together. We flew in from all over the country and went up to Tishomingo, Oklahoma. And the notable thing was that his remains came back. All of his fingers had been broken. So he did not die peacefully, we don't think. The guy in the center is our Tex Birdwell, who was famous in our group, and he's gone. The rest of us are in our reunion.
It's 8:30.
Okay. All right. This is a couple of pictures of me. They like taking pictures in the airplane, so we'll see. Let's just go through a couple of these fast. Okay, more pictures. Okay, this is a B-52 in back of us there. I got one flight in a B-52. They let me fly it around. I got about 3 hours. The interesting thing about this, you could park 7 A4s on the wings of this thing. Okay, that's the difference in size, okay? This is another picture, just a fun picture of planes flying. Go to the next one. Okay, so we got just more Blue Angels pictures. Aviators like to look at pictures. So Gene Owen is now going to read something for us.
You like to look at pictures.
Okay, Gene, so take it away. Is the mic on?
It will be.
I am Jean Owen.
Hold on, please. Turn the mic on, please.
I did this and I can't read it. Is it working? Okay. I am Jean Owen. My special interest in what Dick has shared with us tonight is because my husband too was a Navy pilot 10 years before Dick. I learned from him how very unique this experience was in their lives and how close the squadron members became. Their lives depended on each other. My second connection is my son, who was the command chaplain on the last two deployments of the Enterprise. He brought her home to be retired. What I'm going to read are Dick's thoughts following his last flight aboard the Hancock. Lieutenant R.G. Myers ended the Black Diamond Vietnam Diary at the time by relaxing in Ready Room 5 and writing the following poem. The combat cruise is over, the days of war are done. Now, like the lonely rover, we seek the rising sun. The life we left behind us, we now begin anew, but let us not forget the things we once have had to do. And hope we must. Our cause was just, for victory is dear. The friends we leave behind us, we hope were not in vain, but with the loss of such as those wherein to find the gain. A moral to remember must they bequeath to us. Our dreams must be the stronger now, for theirs have turned to dust. So let us face the coming days we owe, which cannot be repaid. We're homeward bound, it's good to say goodbye to Westpac seas. Ahoy, the golden gate ahead, that ever-loving tease.
Okay, thank you, Dean. That's not going to win any prizes in poetry, I'll tell you that. But it was an expression of how I was feeling at the time. Okay, we're going to take some questions, but first I want to say some thank yous. First, thanks very much to Pat and Jean. You've seen them perform. They're part of the Navy family. They're good friends. Okay, after that, I want to thank Doneen Lawrence and Katie Brandon. They were, Doneen is the marketing manager here, and Katie is the executive director of Pasadena Village, and they put together the flyers and helped get the whole thing together. I thank very much Catherine Custodio, the activities director here, and Bernice Torres, who is our tech support here. We could not have done that without them. I also want to thank Richard Casimir and Casey Jones, two of my shipmates who consulted with me. I got some of these slides from Casey. Casey was a commander of the Blue Angels for a while. So he was flying A4s in the Blue Angels. So I thank them for their contribution. Richard Casimir was our intelligence officer, and he looked up some of the information here. I want to thank Bianca Barajas, who's my partner and friend here in at the front, and she ran the hosting, and Dave Foles, who everybody in the village knows because Dave has helped everybody in the village at one time or another. And Dave was also part of the Navy family because he was on the Hancock. Okay, and next I want to thank Umbra Mohammed, who is an assistant of mine up in Sacramento, and she put the whole slideshow together. There wouldn't have been a slideshow without Umbra. And finally, Sally Curry, and Sandra Moffitt joined in and helped with some forming a Zoom audience for us so we could test this out. So it was all those people that made this work, and thanks to every one of them. So now, if anybody has questions, I ran over a little bit, which I apologize for, but I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
ARG,
Okay.
I'd like to let people know that you were richly rewarded with combat pay of $100 a month or $3.33 a day.
Yeah, Rick, this is Richard Casimir, and he's pointing out that while we were in combat, we were richly rewarded. We got $100 a month combat pay. So we were getting rich over there. All right. Any other questions?
There's a question
There's
over here.
Okay.
Jack, I wanted to say a couple of things there. My second son started taking flying lessons at age 14, helping a pilot wash his private plane. He graduated Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University with a degree in aerodynamics, and he was never able to fly because he has high blood pressure. He would love to have been here and heard your talk. And then the question that I have is, how does the runway at LAX compare with the runway on a?
The runway, I don't know what this, yeah, most commercial airports, the runways are 12, 15,000 feet, and some of them are longer, so they're much bigger. A 5,000 foot runway is a very short runway for anything to land on, any kind of jet to land on. And so that's the difference.
Here's another one.
Okay.
Dick, this is a question about naval air and marine air. Are the missions the same or different? Is the training the same or different? Or are they essentially the same kind of
But well, they're different. They didn't have a nuclear delivery like we had, and they were primarily, because they were a Marine support Air Force, they were primarily focused on close air support, but they would have done anything supporting ground troops. So their missions were much more local. We went through all our flight training with the Marines, so they went through all the same flight training we did. They separated at the point where we got our wings and went into fleet training, where they learned to fly the type aircraft that they were going to fly in the fleet. So that's where we separated. Up to that point, we had exactly the same training. So I had Marines in my pre-flight class and in all my flight training. So they were right there with us.
But they weren't on the same ships.
They were not on the same ship. No, they didn't do shipboard duty. And we would occasionally have a Marine contingent come out. They had to do carrier qualifications every now and then. And it always looked to the people who were doing that regularly, it looked like a zoo, like a bunch of geese coming in trying to land or something. So we always enjoyed seeing the Marines come out to do their carrier quals.
I want to know what kind of brakes do you have in there? I never hear of any brakes. You don't have any brakes.
You have brakes on the foot pedal, so you're driving the plane with brakes. The question was, what kind of brakes do you have? But you got brakes on your foot pedal, so you steer the plane by hitting the brakes. So you hit your left brake to turn left and your right brake to turn right.
That's in the air.
No, in the air, you have speed brakes, and speed brakes on the A4 were just panels on the backside of the fuselage, and when you open your speed brakes out, they just pop out like this, and they created a lot of drag, so they would slow the plane down that way. And we basically, we flew with the speed brakes on because in a jet, you need to have your power up higher because most of the power you get is in the last 10% of the RPMs that the engine will turn up. So you wanted a lot of power available in case you had to go around again.
Yeah, for sure. So grateful that you made it, all those landings.
I didn't hear that.
I said, I'm grateful you made all those landings.
Well, me too. And like I say, there's a lot of luck involved. There was one time when I took a bolter there and I was running out of gas. I had to go do a night plug-in and get some fuel to come around. So that was an exciting time.
Yeah, well, I was with you.
Those of you that are parked with the valet need to think about the valet will leave at 9. If you aren't worried about that and you want to stay and talk to Dick some more, please feel free. Otherwise, thank you all for coming. It's a great shot. Howard. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, yeah.